He made me kneel to gather my scattered resume while telling a colleague in Mandarin I only knew how to open my legs. When I stood up, he just laughed and said, "Sweetie, find a rich husband." I didn't flinch. That same day, the Chancellor called me our largest donor right to his face. I'd been the main donor for my old university for 5 years when they asked if I'd interview for their guest lecturer position. I said yes, but the thing was, at 24, I looked more like the sorority girls studying in the lobby than who I actually was. So on the morning of the interview, when my interviewer Ray saw me, he just looked me up and down like I was a piece of meat. I introduced myself as his 2 o'clock, but he actually laughed, as if what I was saying was a joke. Then, without saying a word, he spotted some guy behind me. "Dr. Patterson," he shouted and waved him right in, then turned and said I'd have to wait since Patterson had important places to be. 90 minutes later, at 3:30, Ray finally called me in. He walked through first and let the door swing shut in my face. Once inside, he pointed at the floor near his desk and told me to stand there. I wanted to sit, so I reached for the chair, but he held up his hand to stop me. And so for the next 5 minutes, I stood like a scolded child watching him leisurely check emails with his feet propped on the desk. When he finally looked up, he seemed surprised I was still there. I reminded him about the guest lecturer interview, and he burst out laughing. He said that he thought I was joking earlier and had assumed I was a sorority girl looking for charity sponsors. He gestured to a chair, then when I sat down, he ordered me to the whiteboard to prove I knew what code looked like. As I stretched up high to reach, he commented on how my dress rode up. He then ordered me to list my qualifications underneath. When I wrote founder and CEO, he laughed so hard he nearly fell off his chair. I started explaining my company through his laughter, trying to tell him about our cloud infrastructure and enterprise solutions, but he was already waving me off. "Fashion blogs don't count as real businesses, sweetie." I protested that it wasn't a fashion blog at all, but he wasn't listening. Instead, he leaned back in his chair studying me with this amused expression. If I was really the CEO I claimed to be, then surely I could manage something simple. He'd give me a basic executive task to prove myself. Coffee. Black. From the faculty lounge. Real leaders pay attention to details after all. I could have walked out right then. Part of me wanted to. But I'd already waited 90 minutes and missed half my board meeting for this interview. I wanted to teach here, give back to the place that shaped me. So I gritted my teeth and went to get his stupid coffee. When I returned with the black coffee he'd requested, he took one sip and spat it back into the cup. Too cold. A competent CEO would have quality standards. I'd have to try again, this time with sugar packets and napkins. By my third trip, other faculty members had started noticing. One asked if I was Ray's new assistant. I bit my tongue and grabbed more packets. When he finally deemed the coffee acceptable, he picked up my portfolio from where I'd set it earlier. He said he might as well see these CEO credentials I claim to have. He read my resume with exaggerated disbelief, pausing at the employee count. 50,000 employees. He asked if I'd meant to type 50, or perhaps counting was another skill I hadn't mastered. He was still laughing at his own joke when Dr. Wang knocked and entered. Ray announced to him that I claimed to run a major tech company, asking while laughing if Dr. Wang could believe it. He waved my resume like it was the funniest thing ever. Wang already looked uncomfortable, but Ray wasn't done yet. He positioned me between them and told me to turn around slowly so Wang could see my executive presence. I did a slow spin while Wang stared at the floor. He tried to leave, but Ray blocked his path. This was educational, he insisted. That's when Ray's elbow knocked my entire portfolio off his desk. I knew it wasn't accidental by the way he watched me drop to my knees to gather the scattered papers. As I bent down in my dress, he switched to Mandarin with Wang. He told Wang to look at the pretty girl on her knees. He bet I only knew how to open my legs, not open a computer. Wang went rigid and responded in Mandarin that it seemed too cruel. Ray assured him I couldn't understand. Blonde girls like me were all the same. When I finally stood with my scattered papers, Ray glanced at my resume still sitting on his desk. He picked it up with 2 fingers like it was contaminated. "Actually," he said, "this belonged somewhere more appropriate." He held it over his garbage can, letting it dangle there for a moment before opening his fingers. It fell directly onto his half-eaten sandwich. Then he insisted that I fish it out before the coffee soaked through because I'd need that as a souvenir. I had to reach into his trash while he watched, pulling my resume from under his lunch. Brown stains were already spreading across my name and qualifications, and his lunch staining my sleeves. Standing there with my ruined resume, he gave me some final advice. Find a rich husband at my fantasy company, since that was obviously my real business plan. That's when the door burst open without warning. The Chancellor rushed in looking panicked, followed by 2 board members. You see, I had scheduled this interview specifically on the same day as our board meeting about funding expansion to cover 2 birds with 1 stone. The Chancellor saw me with my coffee-stained resume and stopped short. Ray instantly jumped to his feet asking what brought them here. The Chancellor said they needed Ms. Moore, me, immediately, because the board couldn't proceed without their largest donor. Ray went white. She's, he began stammering, his eyes opening wider by the second. "Yes, she's our largest donor," the Chancellor told Ray, who was basically hyperventilating. "Don't worry," I turned to Ray in Mandarin. "We all make mistakes. Meet me after my meeting." The Chancellor's words hung in the air as Ray's face cycled through several shades of pale. I watched him grip the edge of his desk, knuckles white, while the board members shifted impatiently behind the Chancellor. The same man who just made me fish my resume out of his garbage now looked like he might need that trash can for an entirely different purpose. I straightened my coffee-stained sleeves and addressed the Chancellor directly, keeping my voice professional despite the fury burning in my chest. The board meeting would need to start soon, but I assured him I'd wrap up here quickly. The Chancellor nodded, though his eyes lingered on the brown stains spreading across my dress. He mentioned they'd wait in the conference room, then ushered the board members out, leaving Ray and me alone with Dr. Wang, who still stood frozen by the door. Ray's mouth opened and closed several times, no sound emerging. His earlier smugness had evaporated faded completely, replaced by something that looked remarkably like terror. He started to stammer an explanation, but I held up my hand. Not here, not now. I had a board meeting to attend, one where we'd be discussing the university's funding for the next 5 years. His face went even whiter at that. Dr. Wang cleared his throat uncomfortably, edging toward the door. I switched back to Mandarin, thanking him for his honesty earlier about finding Ray's behavior too cruel. Wang's eyes widened in shock, darting between Ray and me. Ray's legs seemed to give out as he sank into his chair, the reality of the situation finally hitting him. The blonde girl who supposedly only knew how to open her legs had understood every word of their conversation. I gathered my portfolio with deliberate calm, tucking the ruined resume inside. Ray watched my every movement like a condemned man watching the executioner prepare. Before leaving, I paused at the door and looked back at him. In English this time, I reminded him about our meeting after the board session. He nodded mechanically, sweat beading on his forehead. The walk to the conference room felt both endless and far too short. My heels clicked against the polished floors while my mind raced through the implications of what had just happened. 5 years of donations, 5 years of supporting this institution, and this was how their faculty treated potential guest lecturers? The fury I'd suppressed in Ray's office threatened to boil over, but I forced it down. The board meeting required composure. The conference room buzzed with conversation that died instantly when I entered. 12 pairs of eyes turned to me, taking in my stained dress and disheveled appearance. The Chancellor quickly stood, offering apologies for the delay, and gesturing to my usual seat at the table. Several board members exchanged concerned glances as I settled into the chair, trying to brush dried coffee residue off my sleeve. The meeting agenda sat before me, but focusing proved difficult. Every time I tried to concentrate on the funding proposals, I saw Ray's mocking face, heard his laughter, felt the humiliation of standing there while he treated me like a joke. The board discussed expansion plans, new faculty positions, technology upgrades, all funded primarily by my company's contributions. The irony wasn't lost on me. Halfway through the meeting, my phone vibrated. A text from my assistant asking if everything was all right, noting I'd missed the first half of our company's board meeting for this interview. I typed back a quick response, trying to keep my hands steady. The university's CFO was presenting budget projections, showing how my donations had transformed their technology programs. The same programs Ray taught in. Another vibration. This time, an email notification. The subject line made my blood run cold. Urgent. Regarding your interview today. The sender was Ray. I opened it under the table, careful to keep my expression neutral. His message was a frantic mess of apologies and explanations, begging me not to let this misunderstanding affect the university's funding. He claimed he hadn't known who I was, that it was all a terrible mistake, that he'd be happy to recommend me for the guest lecturer position immediately. I closed the email without responding. The CFO finished his presentation, and the Chancellor called for questions. One board member asked about the guest lecturer program's expansion, wondering if we'd found suitable candidates from the business community. The Chancellor's eyes flicked to me nervously before responding that they were still evaluating options. The meeting dragged on for another hour. Each agenda item felt like torture as I sat there in my stained dress, pretending everything was normal while my phone continued buzzing with increasingly desperate messages from Ray. By the time we reached the final item, discussing the dedication ceremony for the new technology center my donations had funded, I'd received 12 emails and 6 text messages. When the Chancellor finally adjourned the meeting, several board members approached me with concerned questions about my appearance. I deflected with vague mentions of a coffee accident, not ready to explain the full humiliation. The Chancellor lingered as others filed out, clearly wanting to address what had happened but unsure how to begin. I told him I needed to handle something first but would circle back. He nodded reluctantly, worry etched across his features. The walk back to Ray's office felt different this time. I wasn't the nervous interview candidate anymore. I was the woman who'd kept this university's technology program afloat for half a decade, and it was time Ray understood exactly what that meant. His office door was closed, but I could hear movement inside. I knocked once and entered without waiting for permission. Ray jumped up from his desk where he'd apparently been typing another email. Dr. Wang sat in the corner, looking deeply uncomfortable. Ray had obviously summoned him as a witness or perhaps moral support. Ray immediately launched into a stream of apologies, talking so fast the words tumbled over each other. He hadn't meant any harm. It was just a misunderstanding. He'd been having a bad day. He thought I was someone else entirely. The excuses poured out while he wrung his hands, a far cry from the man who'd ordered me to fetch coffee an hour ago. I let him talk himself out, standing in the same spot where he'd made me stand earlier. When he finally ran out of words, the silence stretched between us. Dr. Wang shifted in his seat, clearly wishing he could disappear. Ray's breathing was audible in the quiet room, rapid and shallow. Finally, I spoke. Not about the humiliation or the coffee or the garbage can. Instead, I asked him about his teaching philosophy. He blinked in confusion but stammered out something about preparing students for the real world. I nodded thoughtfully, then asked how making someone fetch coffee prepared them for executive leadership. His mouth opened, but no words came. I continued, asking about his curriculum. Did he teach his students that appearance determined competence? That young women couldn't possibly run technology companies? That it was appropriate to discuss female colleagues in degrading terms in any language? Each question landed like a physical blow. Ray sank lower in his chair with every word. Dr. Wang finally found his voice, interjecting that he'd tried to stop things from going too far. I acknowledged his effort, but pointed out that trying wasn't the same as actually intervening. He'd stood there while his colleague humiliated someone he thought was just a hopeful young applicant. What did that say about the culture they were fostering? Ray attempted another apology, this time with tears threatening at the corners of his eyes. He had a family, he explained. This job was everything to him. He'd never behaved this way before. It was completely out of character. I wondered aloud how many other young young women had sat through similar treatment, too powerless to speak up? How many had fetched his coffee and endured his mockery because they needed the opportunity he dangled? The question hung in the air unanswered. Ray's tears finally spilled over as he begged me not to destroy his career. The irony of his plea wasn't lost on any of us. An hour ago, he'd been the one with all the power, laughing at my aspirations. Now he sat crying in his own office while I stood exactly where he'd positioned me, except this time, I held all the cards. I informed them both that I needed time to process what had happened. The board would expect a report on my interview experience, and I hadn't decided what to tell them. Ray's face crumpled further at this news. Dr. Wang asked quietly if there was anything they could do to make things right. There was, actually. I wanted to see the guest lecturer selection criteria. I wanted to review the interview protocols. I wanted to understand how many other candidates had been put through similar ordeals. Ray scrambled to his computer, pulling up documents with shaking hands. The official protocols bore no resemblance to what I'd experienced. No coffee fetching, no standing requirements, certainly no garbage can humiliation. As Ray printed the documents, his printer jamming twice in his nervousness, I considered my options. The easy path would be demanding his immediate termination. One word to the Chancellor and Ray would be clearing out his office by evening. But something held me back. Maybe it was Dr. Wang's guilty expression, or Ray's complete breakdown, or maybe I just wanted to see if either of them could learn from this. I took the printed protocols and told them I'd be in touch. Ray called out as I reached the door, asking when I'd make my decision. I paused, thinking of all the times he'd made me wait today. Soon, I told him, when I was ready. The uncertainty in his eyes as I left felt like a small measure of justice. The Chancellor waited in the hallway, having apparently stationed himself there after the board meeting. His concern was genuine as he asked what had happened. I gave him the abbreviated version. Ray hadn't realized who I was and had conducted an highly inappropriate interview. The Chancellor's face darkened with each detail, his anger palpable when I mentioned the garbage can incident. He immediately offered to terminate Ray, launching into assurances about the university's zero-tolerance policy for such behavior. I stopped him, saying I needed time to consider the best path forward. The Chancellor looked surprised but agreed to wait for my decision. He did insist on formally apologizing on behalf of the institution, which I accepted with more grace than I felt. My phone showed 23 new messages from Ray by the time I reached my car. I deleted them unread and drove back to my office, my mind churning through possibilities. The easy revenge would be swift and devastating. But something about the whole situation nagged at me. Ray's behavior had been abhorrent, yes, but it hadn't occurred in a vacuum. How many other Rays were out there in positions of power, making assumptions based on appearance? Back at my company's headquarters, my assistant took one look at my stained dress and coffee-damaged portfolio and immediately went into crisis management mode. I waved off her concerns, retreating to my office to think. The view from the top floor stretched across the city, a far cry from Ray's cramped academic space. Yet I couldn't shake the memory of standing in that office, being judged and dismissed based on nothing more than my age and appearance. My laptop showed the recording of our board meeting that I'd missed. The discussion had centered on expanding our educational partnerships, investing in programs that would prepare the next generation of technology leaders. The bitter irony made me laugh out loud. Here we were, planning to pour millions into educational initiatives while professors like Ray were actively discouraging young women from pursuing leadership roles. I pulled up the university's website, navigating to Ray's faculty page. His credentials were impressive. PhD from a top program, published papers, teaching awards. Nothing in his professional history suggested the man I'd encountered today. It made me wonder how many other accomplished professionals hid such ugly biases behind their accolades. An email from Dr. Wang appeared in my inbox. Unlike Ray's frantic messages, this one was measured and thoughtful. He apologized for his failure to intervene more forcefully and acknowledged the cultural problems within their department. He mentioned that he'd been troubled by similar incidents before, but had never felt empowered to address them. My situation, he wrote, had opened his eyes to his own complicity through silence. I drafted and deleted several responses before finally sending a simple acknowledgement. The real conversation would need to happen in person, where I could gauge his sincerity. If changes were going to happen at the university, they'd need allies on the inside. Dr. Wang might be one, if his remorse was genuine. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of meetings and decisions unrelated to the morning's drama, yet every interaction felt colored by the experience. When a young female engineer presented a project update, I found myself wondering what obstacles she'd faced that I didn't know about. When our CFO mentioned university partnerships, I had to force myself to focus instead of thinking about Ray's tear-stained face. By evening, I'd made my decision. Not the quick, satisfying revenge Ray probably expected, but something more complex. Something that might actually create change rather than just punishment. I drafted an email to the Chancellor, copying Dr. Wang but notably not Ray. I proposed a comprehensive review of the university's interview processes, particularly for positions that might attract younger candidates. I offered to fund a task force that would develop better protocols and training programs. The catch, which I didn't spell out but made clear through implication, was that Ray would be the test case. He could keep his job, but only if he participated fully in whatever remedial training the task force recommended. He'd become the guinea pig for a new system designed to prevent others from experiencing what I had. The humiliation of being singled out for reform might teach him more than termination ever would. I sent the email and leaned back in my chair, exhaustion finally catching up. The morning felt like days ago. That naive hope I'd carried into the interview completely shattered. But maybe something better could be built from the pieces. Maybe Ray's degrading treatment would catalyze real change at the institution I'd loved enough to support for 5 years. My phone buzzed with the Chancellor's immediate response. He enthusiastically agreed to the proposal and promised full cooperation. Dr. Dr. Wang's reply came minutes later, volunteering to serve on the task force. Ray's silence was conspicuous, but then I hadn't given him the courtesy of inclusion in the conversation. Let him wonder and worry a bit longer. The drive home took me past the university campus. Students walked the paths I'd once traveled, full of dreams and ambitions. How many of them would face their own Ray someday? How many would be judged and dismissed based on appearance rather than ability? The thought strengthened my resolve. This couldn't be just about one bad interview. It had to be about changing the system that allowed such behavior to flourish. At home, I finally changed out of the coffee-stained dress, dropping it in the trash with a sense of ceremony. The ruined resume followed, though I photographed it first. Evidence, maybe, or just a reminder of how quickly power dynamics could shift. This morning, Ray had held all the cards. Tonight, he was probably lying awake wondering if he'd have a job tomorrow. I poured a glass of wine and settled onto my couch, finally allowing myself to process the full weight of the day. The humiliation still burned, but underneath it was something else. A sense of purpose, maybe. Or just the satisfaction of knowing that Ray's actions had triggered something he never intended. He'd wanted to put me in my place. Instead, he'd given me the ammunition to reshape his entire world. My phone showed one final message from Ray, sent minutes ago. Against my better judgment, I opened it. Unlike his earlier frantic apologies, this one was brief. He accepted whatever consequences I deemed appropriate, and thanked me for not immediately demanding his termination. He promised to do better, to be better, if given the chance. It might have been genuine, or it might have been calculated. Time would tell. I didn't respond. Let him sit with the uncertainty a while longer. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, the beginning of what promised to be a complicated process. But tonight, I raised my glass to the small victory of standing up, of refusing to accept that treatment as normal. Ray thought he'd been interviewing just another hopeful young woman. He'd learned too late that appearances could be deceiving. The city lights twinkled beyond my windows as I considered what came next. The task force would need clear objectives and measurable outcomes. Ray's rehabilitation would need to be genuine, not just performative. The university's culture would need systematic change, not just surface-level adjustments. It was a daunting prospect, but then I'd built a company with 50,000 employees. How hard could reforming one academic department be? My reflection in the window showed a young woman who looked like she could be a sorority girl, the same face Ray had dismissed so readily. But behind that face was a CEO who'd just turned a humiliating interview into an opportunity for institutional change. He'd wanted to teach me a lesson about knowing my place. Instead, he'd learned one about understanding his own. The next morning arrived with 17 missed calls from Ray and a campus-wide email from the Chancellor announcing the formation of a new interview standards task force. I read it over breakfast, noting how carefully worded it was. No mention of specific incidents, just a commitment to ensuring all candidates received fair and professional treatment. Ray's name appeared nowhere, but I knew he'd already received his private notification about mandatory participation. My assistant had rescheduled yesterday's missed meetings, and I spent the morning catching up on company business, but concentration proved difficult. Every time I reviewed a contract or approved a budget, my mind drifted back to Ray's office. The memory of kneeling on his floor, gathering scattered papers while he mocked me in Mandarin, made my hands clench involuntarily around my coffee mug. Around noon, Dr. Wang appeared at my office building's reception. Security called up, and I authorized his entry, curious about this unexpected visit. He arrived looking uncomfortable in his academic blazer, clearly out of place among our modern tech company aesthetic. I met him in a small conference room, watching as he took in the floor-to-ceiling windows and sleek furniture. He'd come to warn me, he explained, wringing his hands nervously. Ray wasn't taking this quietly. He'd spent the morning rallying support among senior faculty, painting himself as a victim of a vindictive donor who couldn't take a joke. Several professors who relied on Ray for committee positions were already grumbling about the task force being an overreach. Wang had overheard Ray planning something for the upcoming faculty senate meeting. I thanked Wang for the information, studying his anxious expression. He seemed genuinely concerned, but I wondered about his motivations. Guilt over yesterday's silence? Fear of being implicated? Or perhaps seeing an opportunity to advance his own position if Ray fell from grace? I filed these questions away while assuring him I could handle whatever Ray attempted. After Wang left, I called the Chancellor. He sounded harried when he answered, and I soon learned why. Ray had filed a formal complaint with the faculty union, claiming harassment and discrimination. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. The man who'd made me fetch coffee and called me degrading names in Mandarin was now crying discrimination because I'd proposed better interview standards. The Chancellor assured me the complaint was baseless, but procedure required an investigation. In the meantime, the task force would proceed as planned. He'd already selected members, including Dr. Wang and several others known for their integrity. The first meeting was scheduled for the following week. I hung up feeling unsettled. Ray was fighting back harder than expected. That afternoon brought another surprise. My assistant forwarded an email from a journalist at the campus newspaper. Someone had leaked details about yesterday's interview, though thankfully a garbled version. The story they'd heard involved a donor throwing their weight around after a failed interview, demanding special treatment. No names yet, but the reporter wanted a comment. I declined to respond, but the damage was already spreading. By evening, the story had morphed through the campus gossip mill. Some versions painted me as an entitled rich kid who couldn't handle rejection. Others suggested Ray had been set up by a vindictive donor looking for an excuse to control faculty hiring. None came close to the truth. The next few days passed in a blur of damage control. I attended my regular company meetings while fielding increasingly frantic texts from the Chancellor. The Faculty Senate had passed a resolution expressing concern about donor interference in academic matters. Ray had given an impassioned speech about academic freedom and the dangers of letting money dictate university policies. Several professors who'd always been friendly at donor donor events, now avoided eye contact when I visited campus. Dr. Wang proved invaluable during this period, sending regular updates about Ray's activities. Ray had started holding informal gatherings in his office, strategizing with sympathetic colleagues. He'd crafted a narrative where he was the victim of a misunderstanding, blown out of proportion by an oversensitive young woman who couldn't take traditional academic mentoring. The fact that I looked so young worked in his favor. Several older professors dismissed the whole thing as generational oversensitivity. The task force's first meeting arrived amid this hostile atmosphere. I attended as an observer, sitting in the back while committee members discussed interview protocols. Ray sat in the front row, arms crossed, radiating hostility. He'd brought 3 colleagues as support, though they looked more like bodyguards. Every time someone suggested stricter standards, Ray's group would mutter about bureaucratic overreach. Halfway through the meeting, Ray stood to address the committee. He launched into a speech about the danger of sanitizing academic culture, of turning professors into customer service representatives afraid to challenge or critique. He painted a picture of a university where donors dictated every interaction, where academic rigor gave way to coddling entitled students. Several committee members shifted uncomfortably, clearly swayed by his rhetoric. I watched this performance with growing anger. The man who'd humiliated me was now positioning himself as a defender of academic integrity. When he finished, receiving scattered applause from his supporters, I caught Dr. Wang's eye. He looked stricken, realizing how effectively Ray was controlling the narrative. The meeting ended without concrete progress. Committee members agreed to reconvene the following week after reviewing existing policies. Ray left surrounded by his supporters, shooting me a triumphant look as he passed. The hunter had become the hunted, but he was proving to be formidable prey. That evening, I received an unexpected call from my company's head of HR. She'd received an unusual inquiry from a professor at my alma mater, asking about my professional background and qualifications. The professor, who hadn't identified himself, claimed to be fact-checking for an article about young entrepreneurs. My HR director, sensing something off, had declined to provide information and called me immediately. Ray was investigating me, looking for ammunition. I thanked my HR director and immediately called my legal team. While I'd wanted to handle this through university channels, Ray's escalation changed things. I needed to protect myself and my company from whatever he was planning. The next morning brought more bad news. The campus newspaper ran a story about the task force, featuring quotes from anonymous faculty members concerned about donor overreach. The article didn't name me directly, but anyone familiar with university politics could connect the dots. My phone started buzzing with texts from other donors asking what was happening. I spent hours on damage control calls, reassuring nervous donors that their contributions weren't being used to control faculty. Several expressed concern about the university's direction if professors felt empowered to treat donors disrespectfully. One major donor mentioned reconsidering their planned gift if the university couldn't maintain professional standards. The chancellor called in near panic, begging me to help calm the situation. Meanwhile, Ray continued his campaign. Dr. Wang reported that Ray had started reaching out to former students, gathering testimonials about his excellent teaching and mentorship. He was building a case that he was a dedicated educator being persecuted for one misunderstood interaction. Some students, eager to support a professor who controlled recommendations and committee positions, provided glowing reviews. The second task force meeting approached with tensions at a breaking point. The night before, I received an email from Ray himself. He proposed a private meeting to clear the air and resolve this misunderstanding. He suggested his office, the same place where he'd humiliated me. The audacity made my blood boil, but I recognized the tactical move. If I refused, he'd claim I was unwilling to engage in good faith dialogue. I countered with a meeting in a neutral location with witnesses present. Ray immediately forwarded our exchange to the task force, painting my response as evidence of my unreasonableness. Why would I need witnesses for a simple conversation, unless I was planning to manipulate the situation? Several committee members expressed frustration at what seemed like unnecessary drama. The second meeting proved even more contentious than the first. Ray arrived with 5 supporters this time, including a former department chair who commanded significant respect. They dominated discussion, turning every proposed reform into a debate about academic freedom and donor influence. When Dr. Wang tried to speak about the need for professional standards, Ray's allies questioned his motives, implying he was trying to curry favor with donors. I watched from my seat in the back, taking notes on Ray's tactics. He never directly defended his behavior from that day. Instead, he kept the discussion abstract, philosophical. He spoke eloquently about the mentoring relationship between professors and students, the need for honest feedback, the danger of coddling. He was rewriting history in real time, turning his humiliation tactics into tough love mentoring. During a break, one of Ray's supporters approached me. Professor O'Catherine, an older woman with sharp eyes, suggested I was letting a misunderstanding spiral out of control. Young women in business needed thick skin, she explained. Ray's methods might seem old-fashioned, but they prepared students for the real world. Had I considered that my reaction might discourage professors from providing honest feedback to female students? I kept my expression neutral while internally screaming. The gaslighting was masterful. Ray had successfully reframed blatant sexism and humiliation as constructive criticism. He'd turned my legitimate complaint into evidence of oversensitivity that could harm other women. I excused myself politely, needing air before I said something I'd regret. Outside, I found Dr. Wang looking equally frustrated. He'd underestimated Ray's political skills, he admitted. Years of faculty politics had taught Ray how to manipulate committees and control narratives. Wang worried the task force would end up producing toothless recommendations that changed nothing. Worse, Ray might emerge stronger, painted as a victim who'd stood up to donor overreach. The meeting resumed with more circular debates. Every concrete proposal got bogged down in philosophical philosophical discussions about academic culture. Ray's allies raised hypothetical concerns about every suggested reform. What if requiring written interview protocols stifled spontaneous teaching moments? What if complaint procedures discouraged honest academic discourse? The committee members, mostly conflict-averse academics, seemed overwhelmed by the pushback. By the meeting's end, the only agreement was to form a subcommittee to study the issue further. Ray volunteered to serve on it naturally. The Chancellor looked defeated as he adjourned the meeting. Ray left surrounded by his supporters, pausing to shake hands with committee members who'd seemed sympathetic to his arguments. He was building alliances while I watched my hopes for reform slipping away. That night, I lay awake reconsidering my approach. Ray had turned my attempt at systemic change into a political battle he was winning. His experience in faculty politics far exceeded mine. While I'd built a successful company, I'd done it in a world where results mattered more than rhetoric. Academic politics operated by different rules, ones Ray had mastered over decades. The next morning, my assistant informed me of a new development. Someone had created an anonymous blog called Donors Gone Wild, featuring thinly veiled stories about wealthy donors trying to control universities. The first post described a young female donor who couldn't handle legitimate criticism and tried to destroy a respected professor's career. The details were distorted but recognizable. Ray's campaign had gone digital. I asked my tech team to investigate the blog's origins, though I suspected they'd find nothing definitive. Ray was too smart to leave obvious digital fingerprints, but the damage was spreading. The post got shared in academic forums and social media groups. Comments poured in from professors nationwide sharing their own stories of donor interference. My situation had become a rallying cry for academic independence. The Chancellor called an emergency meeting. He looked haggard, stress evident in every line of his face. The board was getting nervous about the negative publicity. Some members questioned whether the task force was worth the controversy. Others worried about the donor backlash if the university appeared to side with Ray. He was caught between competing pressures with no easy solution. I realized then that Ray had found the perfect strategy. By turning this into a public battle about donor influence versus academic freedom, he'd made it impossible for the university to take strong action against him. Any punishment would look like donor retaliation. Any reform would seem like academic freedom under attack. He'd created a narrative where he couldn't lose. Dr. Wang texted that afternoon with disturbing news. Ray was planning to propose his own reforms at the next meeting, positioning himself as the reasonable middle ground. He'd suggest minor changes that would appear responsive while changing nothing substantial. The committee, exhausted by conflict and eager for resolution, would likely embrace his proposal. He'd emerge as the voice of reason who'd saved academic freedom while still addressing concerns. I spent the rest of the day strategizing with my team. My head of communications suggested a different approach. Instead of fighting Ray's narrative directly, we could shift focus to positive reforms, create a scholarship program for women in technology, fund mentorship initiatives that demonstrated what good academic guidance looked like, make Ray's behavior irrelevant by building something better. The idea had merit, but it felt like surrender. Ray would face no consequences for his behavior. He'd continue treating young women with contempt, secure in the knowledge that he'd won. Other professors would learn that with enough political skill, they could act with impunity. The system that enabled Ray's behavior would remain intact. As the week progressed, Ray's confidence grew. He held court in faculty lounges, regaling colleagues with stories of standing up to donor pressure. The blog posted more entries, each painting donor involvement in darker terms. Some professors who'd initially supported the task force began wavering, worried about being seen as donor puppets. The third task force meeting arrived with the outcome feeling predetermined. Ray presented his reform proposal with practiced smoothness, minor adjustments to interview protocols, voluntary bias training, a suggestion box for candidate feedback, changes that would create paperwork without altering culture. The committee members looked relieved to have a concrete proposal that avoided controversy. I watched from my usual seat, seeing my opportunity for real change slipping away. Ray had outmaneuvered me completely. His political skills, honed over decades of faculty battles, had turned my legitimate complaint into his triumph. The man who'd humiliated me would emerge stronger than ever, protected by a narrative of academic freedom he'd crafted himself. Dr. Wang spoke against Ray's proposal, arguing it didn't address the core issues. Ray's allies immediately questioned Wang's motives, suggesting he was trying to impress donors for his own advancement. The attack was effective. Wang retreated, unwilling to risk his career further. Other potential allies stayed silent, seeing what happened to those who challenged Ray's narrative. The meeting moved toward adopting Ray's toothless reforms when my phone buzzed. My assistant had forwarded an email that changed everything. A young woman named McCatherine had reached out after seeing the blog posts. She'd interviewed with Ray 2 years ago for a research position. Her experience sounded frighteningly familiar: coffee fetching, demeaning comments, humiliation disguised as mentoring. She'd never complained, assuming it was normal academic culture. I stared at the email, realizing Ray had done this before. McCatherine's story included details that matched my experience too closely to be coincidence. The standing requirement, the whiteboard test, the garbage can. Ray had a pattern, a routine he'd perfected over years. I wasn't his first victim, just the first with power to fight back. I quickly forwarded the email to the Chancellor, then stood to address the committee. I announced that new information had come to light suggesting a pattern of behavior that warranted deeper investigation. Ray's face went pale as I explained, without naming McCatherine, that another candidate had reported nearly identical treatment. The room erupted in shocked murmurs. Ray tried to respond, but his usual eloquence failed him. He stammered about misunderstandings and different mentoring styles, but the committee members looked at him with new eyes. A pattern changed everything. One incident could be explained away. Multiple incidents suggested something darker. His supporters fell silent, suddenly unsure of the man they'd they'd defended. The Chancellor immediately suspended the meeting, announcing a formal investigation into all of Ray's candidate interactions over the past 5 years. Ray protested, but his political capital had evaporated in minutes. Professors who'd supported him began edging away, not wanting association with potential scandal. The narrative he'd carefully constructed crumbled as committee members realized they might have been enabling serial harassment. I left the meeting feeling a mix of vindication and sadness. McCatherine's courage in coming forward had changed everything, but how many others had stayed silent? How many young women had endured Ray's humiliation and assumed it was normal? The system that protected Ray had silenced who knows how many voices over the years. That evening, 2 more women contacted me. Similar stories, similar patterns. Ray's ritualized humiliation had claimed multiple victims, each thinking they were alone. I forwarded their accounts to the Chancellor, watching Ray's house of cards collapse with each new testimony. The professor who'd painted himself as a defender of academic freedom stood exposed as a serial harasser who'd weaponized his power against vulnerable candidates. The investigation began immediately. Ray was placed on administrative leave pending its outcome. His supporters melted away, suddenly remembering urgent commitments elsewhere. The blog mysteriously went dark. Faculty members who'd questioned the task force now praised its importance. The same professors who'd worried about donor overreach now thanked me for bringing accountability to their department. Dr. Wong called that night, his voice mixing relief with regret. He'd suspected Ray's behavior wasn't isolated, but had never found proof. Too many victims stayed silent, afraid of retaliation, or convinced their experiences didn't matter. My willingness to fight back had given others permission to speak. He apologized again for not intervening that day, understanding now he'd been complicit in a system that protected predators. The next few weeks brought a cascade of revelations. The investigation uncovered not just Ray's pattern of harassment, but a department culture that enabled it. Senior professors had heard complaints but dismissed them as oversensitivity. Junior faculty had witnessed inappropriate behavior but stayed silent to protect their careers. Students had warned each other about Ray in whispered conversations, but never formally reported anything. Ray tried mounting a defense, claiming the accusations were coordinated retaliation for his principled stand, but the evidence was overwhelming. Multiple witnesses, consistent patterns. Even his former supporters couldn't deny the clear picture emerging. The man who'd lectured about academic integrity stood exposed as someone who'd systematically abused his power for years. The task force, freed from Ray's obstruction, began developing real reforms: comprehensive interview protocols, mandatory training on appropriate conduct, clear reporting mechanisms that protected complainants. The changes Ray had fought so hard to prevent now moved forward with unanimous support. His opposition had only highlighted how desperately such reforms were needed. My phone rang constantly as word spread through donor circles. Many expressed shock that such behavior had been tolerated. Others shared their own stories of dismissive treatment by faculty, who saw donors as necessary evils rather than partners. The conversation shifted from donor overreach to the need for mutual respect and professional standards. Ray's actions had inadvertently catalyzed broader discussions about university culture. The Chancellor met with me privately to discuss next steps. The investigation would likely recommend Ray's termination, but he worried about legal challenges. Ray had tenure and a union ready to defend him. The process could drag on for months or even years. In the meantime, the university's reputation was suffering. They needed a path forward that demonstrated commitment to change while navigating legal complexities. I suggested focusing on the future rather than punishment. Create a model program for respectful candidate interactions. Establish mentorship initiatives that showed what positive academic guidance looked like. Make Ray's behavior so clearly unacceptable that his defenders would look foolish. Build something better rather than just tearing down what was broken. The Chancellor agreed, grateful for a constructive approach. The transformation began immediately. The task force's recommendations became policy with full board support. Training sessions filled up as professors genuinely engaged with questions of power and respect. Young faculty members felt empowered to speak up about problematic behavior. The culture that had protected Ray for years began shifting toward accountability and professionalism. Ray made one last attempt to salvage his position. His lawyer sent a letter threatening to sue for defamation and wrongful suspension. The letter painted him as a victim of a witch hunt, orchestrated by a vindictive donor. It demanded immediate reinstatement and a public apology. The legal threat might have worked months ago when Ray controlled the narrative. Now it looked desperate, the final gasp of a man who'd lost all credibility. The university's legal team responded with their own letter, detailing the evidence against Ray. Multiple credible accusations, witness testimony, a clear pattern of behavior that violated university policies and basic professional standards. They offered Ray a choice: resign quietly with a negotiated settlement or face public termination proceedings that would detail every humiliating incident he'd inflicted on others. Ray's lawyer requested a meeting to discuss terms. The man who'd humiliated me in his office, who'd made me fetch coffee and fish my resume from his garbage, was now negotiating his own surrender. The power dynamic had reversed completely. He needed the university's discretion more than they needed his resignation. The negotiations dragged on as Ray fought for salvaged dignity from a position of total weakness. During this time, I received a message that touched me deeply. McCatherine wanted to meet in person. She'd been inspired by seeing someone stand up to Ray and wanted to thank me. We met for coffee, 2 women who'd endured the same ritualized humiliation from a man who thought his power made him untouchable. She told me details of her experience that made my anger burn fresh. Ray had refined his techniques over years of practice. McCatherine had internalized the experience, believing she'd failed somehow. Seeing me fight back had reframed everything for her. She wasn't weak or oversensitive. She'd been targeted by a predator who used his position to demean demean women he saw as vulnerable. Our conversation helped both of us process the trauma Ray had inflicted under the guise of academic mentoring. More women came forward as word spread. Each story revealed new depths to Ray's behavior. He had a type: young, ambitious women who looked younger than their accomplishments would suggest. He enjoyed the power of making them doubt themselves, of watching them struggle to reconcile their achievements with his dismissive treatment. The pattern was so consistent it felt rehearsed, a performance he'd perfected over years. The final task force report was damning. It detailed not just Ray's behavior, but the systemic failures that enabled it. Recommendations went beyond interview protocols to address the entire culture of the department. The report became a model for other universities grappling with similar issues. Ray's attempt to prevent reform had instead created a blueprint for comprehensive change. Ray finally agreed to resign. The terms remained confidential, but sources told me he'd negotiated a modest settlement in exchange for going quietly. No admission of wrongdoing, but no ability to claim vindication either. He'd slink away in disgrace, his academic career effectively over. The man who'd wielded power so cruelly would spend his remaining years stripped of the authority he'd abused. The announcement of Ray's resignation came with news of a new initiative. The university would create a Center for Ethical Mentorship, funded by increased donations from investors inspired by the reform efforts. The center would train faculty in respectful engagement and support students navigating academic power dynamics. Ray's victims would have the last word, building something positive from their painful experiences. I attended the press conference announcing the center, sitting in the audience as the Chancellor outlined the university's commitment to change. He thanked the brave individuals who'd come forward and acknowledged the institutional failures that had protected problematic behavior for too long. No names were mentioned, but everyone knew the story behind this initiative. Ray's legacy would be the reforms his behavior had necessitated. Dr. Wang approached me after the conference. He'd been appointed to lead the new center, a role that recognized both his integrity and his understanding of how good people could enable bad behavior through silence. He promised to build something that would prevent future Rays from flourishing. The guilt he carried from that day in Ray's office would fuel his commitment to change. The transformation continued over the following months. Other departments requested training from the center. Universities across the country studied our reforms as a model. What had started as one humiliating interview became a catalyst for widespread change. Ray had unwittingly launched a movement he'd fought desperately to prevent. I sometimes thought about that morning in Ray's office. The humiliation still stung when I remembered kneeling to gather my scattered papers while he mocked me in Mandarin. But that pain had purpose now. It had exposed a predator and transformed an institution. Ray had tried to put me in my place. Instead, he'd given me the power to put him in his. The guest lecturer position remained unfilled for months as the department rebuilt its culture. When they finally approached me again, the process was entirely different. Professional, respectful, focused on my qualifications rather than my appearance. I accepted the position, teaching a course on ethical leadership and technology. My first lecture included a section on recognizing and confronting abuse of power. Some of Ray's former supporters attended that first class. They sat uncomfortably as I discussed how power dynamics could be weaponized against vulnerable individuals. I never mentioned Ray by name, but the examples resonated clearly. Several approached me afterward to apologize for their earlier stance. They'd been blinded by loyalty and academic politics, unable to see the harm their colleague was inflicting. The real victory came in the students' responses. Young women who'd heard whispered warnings about certain professors now felt empowered to speak up. Male students engaged thoughtfully with questions of power and privilege. The culture Ray had embodied for decades was giving way to something better. His victims had transformed their pain into progress that would protect future generations. One evening, grading papers in my new faculty office, I noticed something that made me smile. The coffee maker in the faculty lounge had a new sign: self-service only. We're all adults here. Someone had drawn a smiley face next to it. The same room where I'd fetched Ray's coffee now embodied the respectful culture we'd built. Small symbols, but meaningful ones. Ray's name gradually faded from campus memory, replaced by the positive changes his behavior had sparked. New faculty members knew nothing of the scandal, only that the university had strong standards for professional conduct. The task force's recommendations became normal procedure, unremarkable in their reasonableness. What had once seemed like radical reform now felt like common sense. I continued teaching while running my company, finding balance between both worlds. The university that had shaped me as a student now benefited from my experience as an executive, but more importantly, it had confronted its failures and emerged stronger. Ray had tried to break me with his ritualized humiliation. Instead, he'd created an army of reformers determined to break the system that had protected him. The last I heard, Ray had moved across the country, taking a position at a small community college that either didn't know or didn't care about his history. I hoped he'd learned something from his downfall, but suspected he still saw himself as a victim of political correctness gone too far. Some people never recognize their own cruelty, even when forced to face its consequences. But Ray's individual fate mattered less than the systemic changes his actions had triggered. The Center for Ethical Mentorship thrived, expanding its programs each semester. The interview protocols we developed became a national model. Universities that had once resisted reform now eagerly adopted our standards. Ray's attempt to humiliate one young woman had revolutionized how academia treated all young women. Standing in my office one evening, looking out at the campus where I'd once been dismissed and degraded, I felt a sense of completion. The building where Ray had humiliated me now housed programs designed to prevent such behavior. The department that had enabled him now led the university in respectful practices. The culture that had protected him for years now protected his victims instead. My phone buzzed with a message from McCatherine. She'd been accepted to a PhD program, confident now in her abilities despite Ray's attempts to break her spirit. She thanked me again for fighting back, for showing her that Ray's treatment wasn't normal or acceptable. Her success felt like another small victory against the man who'd tried to convince her she didn't belong in academia. The following week brought an unexpected development. Ray's replacement interview committee contacted me about teaching a specialized seminar on technology leadership. The process was professional, focused entirely on my qualifications and proposed curriculum. No coffee fetching, no standing requirements, just genuine academic discourse about how I could contribute to student learning. I accepted the position and began preparing course materials. My first class approached with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Would students take me seriously despite my young appearance? Would faculty members resent my presence after the upheaval I'd caused? The uncertainty gnawed at me as I organized lecture notes and case studies. The classroom filled with eager faces on that first morning. I recognized several students who'd been in Ray's classes, their expressions curious but open. As I launched into my introduction, explaining my background and what we'd cover in the semester, I noticed heads nodding and hands taking notes. They were here to learn, not to judge based on appearances. 3 weeks into the semester, I encountered Professor O'Catherine in the faculty lounge. She'd been one of Ray's staunchest defenders during the task force meetings. Now she approached with a coffee mug and what looked like genuine contrition on her face. She mentioned attending one of the center's training sessions and realizing how blind she'd been to problematic behaviors she'd normalized over decades. Our conversation was brief but meaningful. O'Catherine admitted she'd mentored young female professors differently than their male counterparts, unconsciously perpetuating double standards. The training had opened her eyes to patterns she'd never questioned. She thanked me for catalyzing changes that benefited not just students, but faculty members who'd been operating with outdated assumptions. Dr. Wang's leadership of the Mentorship Center exceeded all expectations. He implemented innovative programs that went beyond basic training to address deeper cultural issues. Monthly workshops brought together senior and junior faculty to discuss power dynamics openly. Anonymous feedback systems allowed students to report concerning behaviors before they escalated. The department that had protected Ray was transforming into a model of professional conduct. My students proved remarkably engaged, particularly the young women who saw themselves reflected in my journey. During office hours, several shared their own experiences with dismissive professors or industry professionals who'd underestimated them based on appearance. We discussed strategies for maintaining professionalism while standing firm against inappropriate treatment. These conversations felt like passing forward lessons learned from my own painful experience. The university's donor relations improved dramatically as word spread about the reforms. Several major contributors who'd been considering reducing support reversed their decisions, impressed by the institution's commitment to accountability. The Technology Center expansion moved forward with renewed enthusiasm from investors who felt confident their contributions supported an ethical environment. One afternoon, while reviewing student presentations, my assistant forwarded an interesting email. A reporter from a higher education journal wanted to feature our university's interview reform protocols as a best practices case study. No mention of the scandal that prompted them, just recognition of innovative approaches to ensuring respectful candidate experiences. The reforms born from humiliation were becoming a model for positive change. I agreed to participate in the article, focusing on systemic improvements rather than personal experiences. The resulting piece highlighted how universities could proactively address power imbalances in hiring and mentoring. Other institutions began reaching out, seeking guidance on implementing similar programs. Ray's legacy of harassment had inadvertently created a blueprint for preventing such behavior nationwide. The semester progressed smoothly, with students responding enthusiastically to real-world case studies and practical leadership scenarios. Several mentioned in evaluations that they appreciated learning from someone who'd actually built a successful company rather than just studying business theory. My youth, once a liability in Ray's eyes, became an asset in connecting with students navigating their own career launches. During finals week, O'Catherine visited campus for her PhD program interview. She stopped by my office, radiating confidence that would have seemed impossible 2 years ago, when Ray had reduced her to tears. Her interview went flawlessly, with committee members impressed by her research proposals and professional demeanor. She texted me afterward, grateful that the process had been nothing like her traumatic experience with Ray. The Chancellor invited me to the end-of-year faculty reception, where I mingled with professors who'd once viewed me skeptically. The atmosphere was markedly different from previous events. Conversations focused on collaborative opportunities between academic departments and industry partners. Several faculty members approached about potential research partnerships with my company, seeing me as a colleague rather than just a donor. Dr. Wang pulled me aside during the reception to share remarkable news. The Mentorship Center's programs had attracted national attention, with several prominent universities requesting licensing agreements to implement similar initiatives. The funding from these partnerships would allow expansion of support services for students and additional training resources for faculty. What started as damage control was becoming a sustainable force for positive change. Summer arrived with my first semester of teaching complete. Student evaluations exceeded expectations, with many commenting that the course had changed their perspective on leadership and professional conduct. Several young women mentioned feeling empowered to pursue executive roles they'd previously thought beyond reach. These outcomes felt more valuable than any donation I could have made. My company's partnership with the university deepened through internship programs and collaborative research projects. The same institution where I'd been humiliated now served as a pipeline for talented graduates who understood both technical excellence and ethical leadership. Former students joined my company, bringing fresh perspectives and innovative ideas nurtured in an environment that valued respect and professionalism. The one-year anniversary of that awful interview passed quietly. No fanfare or recognition, just just the satisfaction of seeing sustainable changes taking root. New faculty orientations included comprehensive training on appropriate conduct. Interview committees followed protocols that ensured professional treatment of all candidates. The culture shift was becoming normalized, embedded in institutional practices rather than dependent on individual vigilance. I received occasional updates about other universities implementing similar reforms. The ripple effects spread far beyond our campus, touching institutions that recognized the need for change before scandals forced their hand. Professional academic organizations began incorporating our protocols into their recommended practices. Ray's attempt to humiliate one person had catalyzed industry-wide improvements. My second year of teaching brought new challenges and opportunities. The university asked me to develop an advanced seminar on ethical decision-making in technology companies. The irony wasn't lost on me, but I embraced the chance to help students navigate complex professional situations with integrity. The course filled quickly, with waiting lists extending into the following semester. McCatherine successfully defended her dissertation proposal, her confidence evident as she presented complex research to a panel of professors. She'd found her voice in academia, refusing to let one traumatic experience define her capabilities. Her success represented countless others, who might have been driven away by harassment, but now found supportive environments to pursue their ambitions. The Mentorship Center celebrated its second anniversary, with data showing significant improvements in student satisfaction and faculty conduct ratings. Complaints about inappropriate behavior had dropped dramatically, while reports of positive mentoring experiences increased. The numbers validated what many of us felt anecdotally. The culture had genuinely transformed. My life settled into a rhythm of teaching, company leadership, and continued involvement in university initiatives. The dramatic confrontations and political battles faded into memory, replaced by steady progress and collaborative relationships. Former adversaries became allies in maintaining the improvements we'd fought to implement. One quiet evening in my faculty office, I reflected on the journey from that humiliating interview to respected colleague and educator. The path had been painful and complicated, but the destination justified the struggle. The university that had shaped my early ambitions now benefited from my experience and commitment to positive change. A knock interrupted my thoughts. A young student stood nervously at my door, seeking advice about an interview where she'd been treated dismissively. I listened to her story, recognizing echoes of my own experience. But unlike my situation, she had resources and support systems. She knew the treatment was wrong and felt empowered to address it. I helped her navigate the formal complaint process, watching her transform from uncertain victim to confident advocate for her own dignity. The systems we'd built were working, protecting vulnerable individuals from those who would abuse power. Her strength reminded me why the fight had been worthwhile. As the semester ended, I packed up my office for summer break. The campus that had witnessed my humiliation now felt like a second professional home. Colleagues nodded greetings as I walked familiar paths. Students waved from across quadrangles. The transformation was complete, from outsider to integral part of a community committed to respect and professionalism. The guest lecturer position I'd originally sought had evolved into something far more meaningful. Beyond teaching technical skills, I helped shape future leaders who understood that true strength came from lifting others up, not tearing them down. Ray had tried to convince me I didn't belong in academia. Instead, I'd helped create an academia where everyone could belong. My phone buzzed with a message from the Chancellor. Next year's budget included full funding for expanding the Mentorship Center to serve all university departments. The board had unanimously approved, recognizing the return on investment in human dignity and professional culture. The financial commitment ensured these changes would outlast any individual's involvement. I smiled, remembering that morning 3 years ago when I'd stood in Ray's office, humiliated and dismissed. That painful experience had catalyzed transformations neither of us could have imagined. He'd wanted to put me in my place. Instead, he'd given me the power to reshape the entire landscape of academic professional conduct. The drive home took me past the technology center my donations had helped build. Students streamed in and out, pursuing dreams in an environment that valued their potential regardless of appearance or background. The building stood as a monument not to any individual, but to the principle that everyone deserved respect and opportunity. My company had thrived during this period, benefiting from the fresh perspectives of graduates who understood both innovation and ethics. The partnership between academia and industry, once strained by mutual suspicion, had evolved into genuine collaboration. We were preparing students not just for careers, but for leadership that would perpetuate positive change throughout their industries. As I pulled into my driveway, I felt a sense of completion. The acute pain of humiliation had faded, replaced by satisfaction at the comprehensive changes that experience had sparked. Ray's cruelty had backfired spectacularly, creating improvements that would protect countless others from similar treatment. Inside, I poured a glass of wine and settled onto my couch, laptop open to review final grades. My students had exceeded expectations, demonstrating not just technical competence, but emotional intelligence and ethical reasoning. They would enter the workforce prepared to recognize and confront inappropriate behavior, breaking cycles that had persisted for generations. The university's next steps included expanding the Mentorship Center model to affiliated institutions. The ripple effects continued spreading, touching lives in ways we couldn't fully track. Each person who experienced respectful treatment instead of humiliation represented a victory against the culture Ray had embodied. I closed my laptop and raised my glass in a quiet toast. To McCatherine, finding her voice in academia. To Dr. Wang, channeling guilt into positive action. To the Chancellor, navigating political pressures to support necessary changes. To the students who would never know how different things might have been. And yes, even to Ray, whose actions had inadvertently catalyzed more positive change than decades of good intentions might have achieved. The story that began with humiliation had transformed into one of empowerment and systemic improvement, not through dramatic confrontations or unrealistic interventions, but through steady work and commitment to creating better environments for everyone. The young woman who'd been dismissed as just another sorority girl had helped reshape an entire institution's culture. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities. But tonight, I savored the quiet satisfaction of knowing that Ray's attempt to break my spirit had instead strengthened an entire community's commitment to dignity and respect. The best revenge wasn't destroying him. It was building something so much better that his behavior became unthinkable. My reflection in the window showed the same young face that had confused Ray 3 years ago. But behind that face was someone who'd learned that real power came not from humiliating others, but from creating environments where everyone could thrive. The university that had shaped me as a student now bore my imprint as someone committed to ensuring no one else would endure what I had experienced. The city lights twinkled beyond my window as I prepared for bed. Somewhere out there, Ray was living with the consequences of his choices. But more importantly, countless individuals were pursuing their dreams in environments made safer by the changes his actions had sparked. That was the true measure of victory, not his downfall, but their opportunity to rise without facing the obstacles he'd tried to place in my path.